Welcome back to the continuation of Sarah's story, a story that shocked thousands of you in our previous video. If you're just joining us, let me quickly catch you up on the nightmare that began on what should have been the happiest night of Sarah's life. 3 years ago, Sarah Michelle Thompson married the love of her life, David Collins, in a beautiful ceremony surrounded by family and friends. But that night, in their honeymoon suite, the person Sarah trusted most in the world, her Uncle Michael, committed an unthinkable betrayal. He forced himself on her, stealing her wedding night and beginning years of abuse that would nearly destroy her marriage and her sanity. For years, Sarah lived with this devastating secret, unable to tell anyone, not even her husband, about the ongoing nightmare she was enduring. But when her daughter Emma was born, everything changed. The fierce protective instincts of motherhood finally gave Sarah the courage to break her silence. Today, we're continuing Sarah's journey from victim to survivor, and you're about to witness how one woman's courage to speak the truth brought justice not just for herself, but for other victims who had been silenced for far too long. Before we continue with this powerful conclusion, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you missed part 1 of Sarah's story, make sure to check it out after this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because stories like Sarah's need to be heard. 6 months after Emma's birth, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't live with the secret anymore. Not when it meant putting Emma at risk. She waited until David had fallen asleep, then retrieved a letter she had written months earlier. A letter detailing every assault, every threat, every moment of terror that Uncle Michael had subjected her to. But reading that letter also reminded Sarah of her own strength. She had survived 3 years of ongoing abuse. She had protected her marriage as much as she could, while carrying an unbearable burden. She had brought a beautiful daughter into the world, and was determined to give Emma the safety that had been stolen from her own life. Maybe it was time to stop surviving and start fighting back. Sarah spent the next several hours writing a new letter, this one addressed to David. In it, she told him everything. She started with her wedding night and detailed every assault, every threat, every moment of terror. She explained why she had been unable to be intimate, why she had panic attacks, why she couldn't bear to be touched. She told him about her fears for Emma and her determination to break the cycle of abuse and silence. The letter was 15 pages long by the time Sarah finished writing. Her tears had smudged some of the ink, and her hand cramped from gripping the pen so tightly. But as she sealed the letter in an envelope and wrote David's name on the front, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Relief. The secret that had been poisoning her life was finally going to be shared with the person who loved her most. She left the letter on David's pillow and took Emma to the living room, where she spent the rest of the night holding her sleeping daughter and waiting for her husband to wake up and learn the truth that would change everything. When David woke up and found the letter, Sarah heard him gasp from the bedroom. She listened to the silence that followed as he read her words, imagining his shock and horror. When he finally emerged from the bedroom, his face was pale, and his eyes were red with tears. "Sarah," he said, his voice breaking. "Oh God, Sarah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't know. I'm so sorry I couldn't protect you." He crossed the room and knelt beside her chair, careful not to wake Emma as he pulled Sarah into his arms. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to be held without flinching. 2 weeks later, Sarah and David decided it was time to tell her parents. Sarah's hands shook as she dialed her mother's number, asking if she and David could come over to discuss something important. They arrived at the Thompson home on a cold January evening, leaving Emma with David's mother to ensure the conversation wouldn't be interrupted. "There's something I need to tell you about Uncle Michael," Sarah finally managed to say. "Something that's been happening for years, something that started on my wedding night." The color drained from her parents' faces as Sarah began to speak. She told them everything: the assault in the honeymoon suite, the years of ongoing abuse, the threats that had kept her silent, her fears for Emma's safety. Her mother's initial reaction was denial. "That's impossible," Linda said, shaking her head. "Michael would never. He loves you like his own daughter." But as Sarah continued to share specific details, her mother's denials became weaker. Her father sat in stunned silence, his face growing darker with each revelation. "Why didn't you tell us?" Linda finally asked, tears streaming down her face. "Why didn't you come to us immediately?" Sarah tried to explain about the shame, the fear, the threats, but the questions felt like accusations. The confrontation lasted until well after midnight, but by the end, both parents were convinced of the truth and ready to support Sarah in whatever actions she wanted to take. The meeting ended with a plan. Sarah's parents would confront Uncle Michael, giving him a chance to admit his crimes. If he denied the allegations, they would support Sarah in pursuing legal action. Most importantly, Uncle Michael would be immediately cut off from any access to Emma or other children in the family. 3 days later, Robert and Linda arranged to meet with Uncle Michael at his apartment. They didn't tell him why, only that it was urgent family business. When they confronted him with Sarah's allegations, Uncle Michael's response was exactly what Sarah had expected and feared. He initially denied everything, claiming Sarah was mentally unstable and making up stories. When faced with specific details, he shifted strategies, trying to minimize it, claiming it was just family affection that Sarah had misinterpreted. He said she had always been overly sensitive and suggested that her post-pregnancy hormones were making her delusional. But Linda surprised everyone, including herself. The mother who had initially struggled to believe her daughter became fiercely protective when faced with Uncle Michael's attempts to gaslight the family. "I told him I believed my daughter completely," Linda later told Sarah. "I told him his access to our family was over forever." Uncle Michael's final response was telling. Instead of continuing to deny the allegations, he became angry and threatening. He reminded them of all the ways he had helped their family financially, suggesting that turning against him would be devastating. But most disturbing was his parting comment as they were leaving. Sarah should be careful about making accusations she can't prove, and she should think about what's best for that beautiful little girl of hers. The implied threat against Emma was unmistakable and terrifying. That night, Sarah and David made the decision to pursue legal action. Uncle Michael had made it clear he had no intention of taking responsibility, and his threat against Emma meant silence was no longer an option. Finding the right lawyer proved challenging. Several attorneys declined the case, citing the difficulty of prosecuting sexual assault charges when years had passed since the initial incidents. Finally, Sarah found Rebecca Martinez, a lawyer who specialized in delayed disclosure cases and believed Sarah's story. "I want you to understand that this will be difficult," Rebecca warned. "Defense attorneys will try to put you on trial instead of the perpetrator. They'll question why you didn't report immediately, why you continued attending family gatherings. You need to be prepared for them to scrutinize every aspect of your life." The legal process began with Sarah filing a police report. The detective was compassionate but realistic about the challenges they faced. With no physical evidence and no witnesses to the actual assaults, the case would largely depend on Sarah's credibility and any corroborating evidence they could gather. Rebecca suggested Sarah undergo a forensic interview with a specially trained psychologist. The interview was exhausting and re-traumatizing, but the psychologist's report would be crucial evidence supporting Sarah's case. Meanwhile, David documented every interaction with Uncle Michael, recording threatening phone calls and saving text messages. The investigation revealed information that both validated Sarah's experience and broke her heart. Police discovered that Uncle Michael had been previously investigated for inappropriate behavior with minors, though no charges had been filed. Most devastatingly, 2 other young women came forward with similar stories of abuse. Learning that other women had suffered because she had stayed silent was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the process for Sarah, but it also strengthened the legal case and showed a clear pattern of predatory behavior. As the trial date approached, the pressure on Sarah intensified. Rebecca spent countless hours preparing Sarah for cross-examination. They practiced answering hostile questions about her delay in reporting, her continued contact with Uncle Michael, and her decision to marry David despite her trauma. "Remember," Rebecca told Sarah, "the defense attorney's job is to create reasonable doubt. They'll try to confuse you, anger you, or make you appear unreliable. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and remember that telling the truth is more powerful than any legal strategy they might use." The preparation forced Sarah to confront aspects of her trauma she had tried to suppress. She had to examine why she had continued attending family gatherings, why she hadn't sought help sooner. Understanding her own responses to trauma was crucial for explaining them to a jury. David also prepared for testimony, as he would describe the changes he had observed in Sarah's behavior. The other victims were preparing too, though their experiences had been different. The similarities in their stories, the grooming behavior, the exploitation of trust, the threats to maintain silence, would be powerful evidence of Uncle Michael's pattern. As the trial grew closer, Uncle Michael's behavior became increasingly erratic. He violated the restraining order, showing up at Sarah's workplace. He made desperate attempts to contact Sarah directly, leaving voicemails that ranged from apologetic to threatening. Each violation was documented as evidence of his character and attempts to intimidate witnesses. The community tension reached a breaking point when Uncle Michael's supporters organized a fundraiser for his legal defense, claiming he was the victim of false accusations. Sarah's supporters countered with events focused on supporting survivors. The case had become a symbol of larger debates about believing victims and holding powerful men accountable. The trial began on a cold February morning, nearly 5 years after Sarah's wedding night assault. The courtroom was packed with supporters from both sides. Sarah's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. For 3 days, she answered questions about the most traumatic experiences of her life, maintaining her composure despite the emotional toll. The cross-examination was brutal but expected. Uncle Michael's defense attorney questioned every aspect of Sarah's story. Why hadn't she screamed? Why had she continued attending family gatherings? Why hadn't she told David immediately? Sarah had prepared for these questions, but answering them in a packed courtroom was incredibly difficult. "I was in shock," she explained. "This was someone I trusted completely, someone I loved like a father. I couldn't process what had happened. I was afraid no one would believe me. I was ashamed, and I blamed myself." The defense tried to paint Sarah as unstable, seeking attention through false accusations. They highlighted her panic attacks as evidence of mental illness rather than trauma. But Sarah's consistency under pressure, her detailed knowledge of events, and her obvious emotional pain made her credible. The forensic psychologist's testimony about trauma responses helped the jury understand why Sarah's behavior was consistent with an abuse survivor rather than someone making false accusations. The testimony from the other victims was equally powerful. Their stories showed a clear pattern of grooming, abuse, and intimidation consistent with Uncle Michael's treatment of Sarah. The defense's attempts to suggest the women had coordinated their stories fell apart when faced with specific, personal details each woman provided. David's testimony about the changes in Sarah's behavior provided additional corroboration. He described her panic attacks, her inability to be intimate, her withdrawal from family activities. His obvious love for Sarah and his pain at watching her suffer made a strong impression on the jury. Uncle Michael chose not to testify, a decision that seemed like an admission of guilt to many observers. The closing arguments crystallized the central issue. The prosecution argued that 3 brave women had overcome shame and fear to speak truth about a man who had used his position of trust to abuse them. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, Sarah held David's hand tightly, trying to prepare for the possibility of acquittal. On the charge of sexual assault in the 1st degree, the jury foreman announced, "We find the defendant guilty." Similar guilty verdicts followed for each charge, representing not just Sarah's abuse, but the suffering of all Uncle Michael's victims. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Sarah chose to read a victim impact statement. "You stole my wedding night," she told Uncle Michael, her voice strong and clear. "You stole years of my marriage, my ability to trust, my sense of safety. But you didn't steal my voice, and you didn't steal my power to protect my daughter and other children from predators like you." Uncle Michael was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with possibility of parole after 10 years. He would be registered as a sex offender for life, limiting his access to potential victims. It wasn't as long as Sarah had hoped, but it sent a clear message about the seriousness of his crimes. The trial's conclusion marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The legal victory was important, but the real work of healing was just beginning. Therapy became crucial to Sarah's recovery. Working with a trauma specialist, she began to understand how the abuse had affected her ability to trust and her sense of self-worth. Sarah's marriage to David grew stronger as they worked together to rebuild intimacy and trust damaged by years of secrecy. David attended therapy sessions too, learning how to support Sarah and dealing with his own anger about not recognizing what was happening sooner. Their love and commitment to their family provided a foundation for recovery. Emma remained blissfully unaware of the trauma that had shaped her early life. Sarah was determined to raise her daughter with the ability to trust her instincts, speak up when something felt wrong, and know she would always be believed and protected. The cycle of silence that had enabled Uncle Michael's abuse would end with Sarah's generation. Sarah returned to teaching, finding purpose in her work with children. Her experience gave her unique ability to recognize signs of abuse and create safe spaces for vulnerable students. She also began speaking to groups about sexual abuse prevention, turning her painful experience into a force for positive change. 3 years after the trial, Sarah received a letter from a young woman who had read about her case. The woman had been abused by a family member and had been living with the secret for years. Sarah's story had given her the courage to report her abuser and seek help. Letters like this reminded Sarah why speaking out had been the right choice. Sarah's journey from victim to survivor to advocate shows us that healing is possible, that justice can be found even years after trauma occurs, and that speaking truth, even when that truth might shatter everything we thought we knew about our families, is sometimes the most important thing we can do. What do you think gave Sarah the final push to break her silence after so many years? How do you think you would have handled the legal battle and community scrutiny? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story has moved you, please share it with others who might need to hear about the power of survivor courage. Subscribe for more stories that explore human resilience and the strength it takes to seek justice. And remember, if you or someone you know has experienced abuse, you are not alone, it's not your fault, and help is available. Sarah's story reminds us that our darkest experiences can become sources of strength, not just for ourselves, but for others who need to know they have the power to break their silence too.